Nice to see you far away. So what is going on here? In the one video, of course, very famous, shown all over the world, the 9/11 Twin Towers event. I mean, it's been with us for a few years now and was probably shown at least 100 times on the major channels around the world. The other event, of course, as you can see by the comments made there, for the last 17 years, this gentleman said he's been oppressed because of his religion, but you won't see too much about that on television. So really the argument is that the way we understand in modernity, the way we understand those who are oppressed, conflicts in religion, and if an event is important, has much to do with the media. So bear that in mind. Now, I decided to end this series of lectures with how to resolve all of this. How do we as Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus attempt to bring about some sort of peace in the world? And you as future negotiators for South Africa and for humankind around the world, I thought it is a good idea that you see how communication and dialogue can be used in a better way to bring about not just peace between yourself and a better relationship between yourself and people of other faith groupings, but also a better understanding as to how perhaps the resolution, conflict, and the interfaith dialogue can progress in a better way. If I open the slides. Okay, so what I've done is I've put together a summary of the contributions by these different authors and writers, and you can see through here there's a Rabbi Arthur Schneier, there's a Reverend Canon Charles Gibbs, there's a kind of Muslim sounding name, Muhammad Abu Nimr, and a variety of others. So they are addressing the interfaith dialogue process and how it is we can better negotiate our way around the world in a secular environment where we meet people of diverse cultures and religions. And there's a few insights that we have to think about critically, and we'll reflect back to the two videos that we've seen. The first is that religion is cited as a cause of international conflicts more frequently than the facts would warrant. In other words, what are they saying here is that we oftentimes read a little bit more into it than the facts suggest. And as a theorist of interpersonal and mass communication in sociology, I can tell you that this falls squarely within the ambit of violence in the media, violence or children viewing violence, for example. The questions asked, for example, is it true that if children view violence that they're affected negatively? I'd be quite surprised if anybody here can give me a definitive answer. But we have an idea. Our parents tell us, oh, don't watch that, that's too violent. Or don't let our younger children see violent movies, for example. But what's the facts? Is it the case that that this media imaging affects children? Similarly, is it really true that religion is that prevalent in depictions of violence and conflict in the world? And the second is, when religion is a factor, it is but one of several interrelated causal factors. It is almost never the only reason. It's almost always other things like ethnicity, economic disparities, land, regional differences. And then the other is the different authors that do research about this, and different researchers, like the Rabbi Arthur Schneier suggests, that religion is never the cause of conflict. And that although it is often identified as an excuse for other causes. So I think that's one end of the spectrum. But there are others. For example, some of the names you saw on the list, some of those authors suggest that religion is one of several components of conflict between religions. And I think the truth maybe lies there, that it is not necessarily religion, it could be a secondary or a further down important component. One of the authors cites religion as being a central element, for example, in Northern Ireland. But there again, it is not the only one. There are other political features that are important in understanding conflict in the Northern Irish case. But how do we solve this? At some stage, we have to come together and we have to talk. Otherwise, we'll fight forever. Now, as a rule, there are different approaches, first of all, to resolving tensions and conflict. Now, if you reflect back to George Bush when he came on with the 9/11 video, he said, it is war. It is not just terrorism, this is war. In other words, he has an orientation towards the whole affair. We're going to fight. There is no need for further negotiations. There's no need for peace. A Christian who follows Jesus may say, but, how about showing some compassion? I use the example of carpet bombing and stuff like that. You know for a fact that is not perhaps the teachings of Jesus Christ. Yet those fights are often rationalized and legitimated in the name of Christianity. So there are many, many reasons why people legitimate and continue on with these battles. And often it's not the case of it being a religious fight one against the other. So we need to understand when these conflicts come up, that what the orientation is, first of all. Is it an exit response, for example, to the conflict? And an exit, as in George Bush's case, an exit response to peace, an exit response to finding a solution. Now these exits could be psychological, just switching off, saying there's going to be a loser. So a lose-lose orientation. Or it could be physical, slamming the door on peace. This is war. This is beyond terrorism. This is, you see, the language already sets the climate for any further outcomes to even something as terrible as the World Trade Center Twin Towers bombing. So when we enter these dialogues, be it your personal, interpersonal communication and conflict resolution with other people, or mass global conflict, there needs to be some sort of voice response to it. It's no sense not saying anything and neglecting the situation. Something's got to be done. And the argument is by researchers of communication and dialogue that the voice response is an active, positive response, and that it is almost the best to talk, even if you shout. The one thing that's important in a conflictual situation that's, I guess, primary is that conflict only exists if there's mutual dependence. So let's visit the two videos again about this mutual dependence. If the Western world is dependent on the Middle East for oil, which they are, undoubtedly, it's how it works, the world works like this, then there'll be conflict, and that conflict needs to be resolved. If the modernity is not as dependent on Burma for their resources, there won't be conflict. It may not be an important issue. It may be the first time in your lives that you realize that there's conflict between Buddhists and Muslims in Burma, because it's not that important to those who are in power. So these are the type of questions that we can think about in the preamble to conflict in the first place. Be that as it may, dialogue has to take place. Interfaith dialogue is one area of looking at it and working through it. So the first thing they find, these scholars, is that it can be of great value in bringing about some sort of move towards amelioration in the conflict So softening it, the conflict, opening up doors for perhaps reconciliation later. But you can't get there. One, I can tell you, you can't get there if you already spin a disconfirming climate. If you say, it's them against us, it's war, then you've already decided that the climate ahead will be one of disconfirmation and that we're going to battle it out and there'll be no talk, there'll be no dialogue. And the argument here is that even if religion, as the scholars suggest, may not be the primary component of the conflict, even if religion is not, it is still a good idea to talk about it from a religious perspective. So this is, the bottom line is, it is important to have dialogue. It is important to talk about issues. And that oftentimes, religion may not be the primary issue or the primary identity of the two groupings, but they see themselves as, oh, we are mostly Buddhist and you are mostly Muslim, and therefore interfaith dialogue can be productively employed in the discussion or the preamble leading up to potential reconciliation and conflict resolution between groups. The other thing, of course, is religious people have always seen themselves, hulle het maar altyd hulle self gesien as peacemakers. I mean, you just have to look at the South African case study. Post-apartheid, you have Desmond Tutu, Alex Borain coming up with a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they see themselves as peacemakers. I mean, Desmond Tutu is a prime example. He's always on TV when there's political and religious issues. Some sociologists may argue that the very reason why he shows or proposes to represent Christianity in South Africa is because, one, he sees it as his sacred duty as a Christian to deal with issues of conflict. Others may argue his church is so small, there's so few members that support his church at the moment that perhaps he's looking for a religious idea to show his position in the church. So all sorts of, but the bottom line here is that they see themselves as sacred peacemakers, and they have that historical traditional role as the peacemaker, the clergy. And we're going to talk about the clergy, and if it is just the clergy, and is it important that the clergy must be there in this interfaith dialogue in the first place. So the talks and the discussions may not be necessarily religious. So it could be an issue of land. Let's say Palestine. I mean, it's all about land, it looks like it. It may be political. It sounds like it's all about land and politics. You don't have the right to come. This is not your national homeland. This is not your piece of earth. You are rationalizing your position here, coming here in 1948 as a Jewish person to Israel and saying, but God gave this to us a few thousand years ago. God made a deal with Abraham, a berith, a covenant, the land of Canaan. And in 1948, we want it back. And the Palestinians that are there may say, but that is your faith statements. It doesn't work with us. So the use of religion to rationalize the fight. But in the first instance, you may argue, but it's just a political thing for a nation building. And that land is being negotiated by the two parties, and politics and nationhood and nationalisms is being negotiated, not religion. But it becomes, it's a Jewish versus the Muslims. They forget about the thousands and thousands of Christians that have been in that region for 2,000 years. They forget that Jesus was born there. I mean, this is interesting. Jesus was a Palestinian. Jesus was born in Palestine. So, completely negated to suit political aims. But it does offer an opportunity, even though they come together as two religious groupings, it does give them an opportunity to offer at least a component of spirituality. So, in the process, let's say the Christian says, okay, I forgive you for shooting my cousins and my family. It is almost a Jesus-like action. It has a deep sense of spirituality. And chances are that it will have a lasting legacy because people are willing to live by the sacred in that way, to forgive from a Christian perspective. So it has meaningful outcomes and encounters, especially if religion is that deeply invested in the negotiations. And then the other scholar in the group, David Steele, he does his work on the Balkans and the major genocides and ethnic cleansing that went on there in Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Croatia, and so forth. And he concluded with his research that the best outcomes from a Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Hindu leadership perspective is that if the middle ranges of the leadership gets involved. So rather than the Bishop Tutus only, not saying he's not important, he is important, but it's perhaps better that at a community level that church leaders and religious leaders from diverse groupings come together so that it could be fed through a lot more egalitarianly from a religious perspective in communities. And the United Religions Initiatives, for example, in their research concluded that it has greater impact when it works at this community level. And if you think back to South Africa, in our history, South African history, we had lots of conflict in the past. We had lots of conflict for the last 300 years. And certainly it seems to work well because the post-apartheid era, because many of these church leaders were coming from all sectors of South African society, speaking to people about reconciliation and so forth. So let's take the question. It's okay. Asseblief, ek het nog nie veel Afrikaans gepraat nie, maar ek mag graag Afrikaans ook vra.
Maybe like you showed two videos of conflict in religion, but I think that there are people that can actually live together, from different religions. And I think we should see more videos about that, and we can learn from those communities instead of showing us conflict. Let's just ask those people how have they lived for hundreds of years together. Even in Kenya, although the 1998 bombing happened, now they're still living alongside Muslims, but you don't look at that video of how they actually reconciled after that and managed to live together. You just saw bombings, people crying, disaster, but no reconciliation after that. And they are living together alongside, even if the Al-Shabaab are coming in, but they're not hating on the Muslim brothers.
Okay, so she's actually leveling a complaint against the media. By saying that, she's really, in exactly our last lecture, we ended with that sort of statement with the last lecture, the role of fundamentalism and the use of fundamentalists and the media, and the reciprocative use of the media with fundamentalism. This is exactly the point, that you see so much of this type of news coverage and media coverage, exactly because it's so sensational, exactly because people like to watch this type of media propagation. But it certainly doesn't, again, the first statement we made was that oftentimes religion is not as complicit in the conflict as we think. The facts doesn't support it. And perhaps the reason for that is the perpetuation of the type of videos that I showed you and the media's investment in those events. And similarly, the fundamentalists and those who want to show their success through the media, that we end up with an idea that the world is a lot more violent than perhaps it really is. So your point taken. I mean, it'd be great to see a lot more happiness and peace, but it looks like this relationship between media and audiences doesn't work that way. Violence, the same thing. There's more and more and more and more violence every year as we watch movies. I mean, there's statistics about that. Rambo, for example, in the first Rambo, they killed one person. In Rambo 4, there's 190 killed. So it's almost like a desensitization we need to see as audiences. Therefore, it's important for you to be educated as audiences with this institution of media, so that you can understand why it is that we understand religion and violence the way we do in the mass media. Another question?
Obviously, that is like an ideal situation. But from a realistic point of view, what would you So like, what would you say are the first steps in terms of bringing, like, resolving the conflict, for example, between the Middle East and America? You know, or on a smaller scale, you know, for example, say Christians living in Burqa, you know,
Yes.
that might have conflict in terms of Muslims there. What would you say would be the first?
You've already done it. You go to a Muslim, to a mosque, and you visit, and the ignorance that you have of other people leaves. You're suddenly no longer scared. You suddenly realize that these people wash their hands almost in a baptism ritual. You learn about diversity and different religions in classrooms like this. So you realize that there's actually some sort of relationship historically between these traditions, and that the religions, all of them really, in theological terms, don't propagate and profess violence. By being educated, this is the most important, is the first step towards accepting diversity. And you went beyond that, you learned about the social constructions of reality. I mean, in the end, it is all constructed realities. You wouldn't be sitting here if your parents were affluent and they could send you to a school in America. You may not be here, but you're a product of your environment. So I think you're doing the right things. And the more educated a society is, and I started off with this, the more educated you are as an individual, the chances of conflict is minimized significantly because you understand how the world works. You understand that you're not the only religion, the only faith system, the only ontology and epistemology. There are others as well. Let me take us.
I have a perfect example to join your statement about ignorance. I have Muslims, Jews, and Christians in my family, and we fought a lot about it. But in the end, like I've been to a mosque, I've been to a synagogue, they've been to Christian churches, and you learn about each other, and it's all the same basically.
Exactly. So that's fantastic. I mean, we are a multicultural society, we say. We're diverse. And as a group of South Africans, I think we do very, very well. We don't have the level of conflict that many other places, first world, secular countries in the world have. So I think for that we can applaud ourselves. But let me go a little further and we see perhaps some of the other issues. Some of the principles that determine the quality of the outcome and also the quality of that negotiations between her Christian, Muslim, and Jewish family. I mean, this is for global as well, micro as well as macro level understanding of how we deal with other peoples. The first is that when you talk to other people and you want to discuss your Christianness or your Islamicness with your friend or your neighbor or your classmate, is that you need to have a clear purpose. Don't suddenly start you want to have discourse, dialogue, you want to talk about your religion, but you bring in race immediately. Say, hey, maar ons is swart Christene. And so you mix it up. Maybe smarter if you want to have good outcomes and set confirming climates is to ask and to set agendas ahead of time so that you know exactly what you're going to be talking about. Similarly, in a macro and a global context, it's no use you talk about Palestine, Israel when they come to the table, but when they get to the conversation, they want to talk about the last 50 years of how many people were killed and seriously complicate the process. I mean, it's important things. It needs to be discussed, but it's always good to have a clear purpose for the discussion. The most important here, also important here, is to have the right participants. It's no use you're going to dialogue, discuss, debate with other people if 3 of your friends that are with you come with an agenda that they want to bring you down and they're very good at wanting to get just their way. So the choice of participants is important in this conflict resolution. You have a question, Mone?
Yeah, I was thinking about participants now, which is kind of the reason I think that interfaith dialogue can't work, because in order for it to work ideologically perfectly, you need 2 people who embody their faith systems completely. And that would be basically Buddha and Jesus and Muhammad in a room sitting and like sorting things out.
Yes.
But that never happened. If that was the case and you got people like that who kind of embodied the Christian faith, then George Bush would have said after 9/11, yeah, there's no retribution to be had. We're a peaceful
Absolutely. But we also embody some of the principles of modernity. We also, which includes the respect for other people, the respect for diversity. I mean, this is the idea. I mean, we would think as moderns that we have gone beyond that era where we pull swords and pull out Tommy guns and stuff like that, and that we can really resolve conflict with dialogue, and that we can live with other people. So the participants, the choice of participants is important. People who are committed to peace. I mean, how are you going to have resolution when people who are committed to warfare sits across the table from people who are committed to peace? Good listeners are important. And if you just want to say your thing all the time and you don't allow the other person to make their point as if they have no issue, then it's not going to work. Maybe close to what Morning says, but I think with a little bit more resources, is that if you're a Christian and you're going to be negotiating for Christianity, it'd be good to have somebody who is grounded in the Christian faith, rather than negotiate your Christianity away. I mean, this is dishonest. You have to stand by your belief system. And then, of course, opinion leaders. Now, opinion leader may not be a guy like Tutu. I mean, when he came out against the Dalai Lama, the ANC's moves against the Dalai Lama, for example, the people from the African independent churches said, who does he think he is? He doesn't represent religions in this country. He's the leader of a small group of Anglicans. We represent 37% of the South Africa's religious population. We, the African church priest and class. But he's still an opinion leader. It could be your school teacher. As the research shows, it is more successful when there's more middle-class leadership, middle-level leadership, not middle-class, middle-level leadership of different churches. And of course, smaller groups better than larger groups in the negotiation process. Because there are lots of people, then it's more difficult to control participants, more difficult to control agendas. People come up, they want to give their point of view and push their agendas and so forth. So very simple stuff. It's not a bad idea to have people come together first, talk about what it is that's important for them, what it is they want to talk about, what it is they want to negotiate, and then to come together and say, these are important to us, these are important to you, what are we going to talk about, discuss over the next hour and a half or 2 hours. There's also the time factor. So you can't just say, well, we want to talk about all of these, but you only have an hour, and you can't solve the Palestine-Israel issue that's been ongoing for 50 years. You want to solve it in an hour, but you want more than just that. You also want to solve the world crisis, oil crisis, for example. It doesn't make sense, right? And then, of course, it is important to understand the balance of power. If you look at the second video, for example, you have a small amount of Muslims from Burma that are fighting against really the Burmese nation state, whose weight is really maybe behind Buddhism. So there may be officers within the Burmese police or army that's heavy-handed, as he suggested, with the helicopters that's coming after the boats, etc., to have an understanding of the scales of power. How do you negotiate if you're a small number of people on boats that are leaking, trying to escape against a nation like Burma, roughly? So these critical questions are important. Also the language is used. I mean, language is the most important. How can we have interfaith dialogue if I speak to you just in English? I should speak a little bit of Afrikaans. Dit is mense wat Afrikaans baie belangrik vir hulle is. En dit is, kan maar sê, amper heilig, so van 'n religieuse standpunt. Dit is belangrik en dit moet gebruik word. En het sal verkeerd wees om dit nie te doen nie. So as daar daardie konflik is, om in ag te neem die tale wat gebruik word. Dit is, jy sal sien aan die einde hoe belangrik die vermoë is om hierdie interfaith dialogue aan die gang te kry. Dit gaan regtig oor verbal skills and communication skills and how you understand outcomes. Maar as jy dit doen, jy's goed daarmee, maar jy's nie so goed in Engels nie, jy's Afrikaans sprekend, dan gaan jy miskien kort kom. Van daai ander persoon wat teen jou debatteer, heel wat beter skills het in Engels. So dialogue needs to explore both similarities and conflict differences between the two, rather than self-summarizing. Maar ek het dan gesê dis so en so en so en so. Jy nie gehoor nie? I mean, that's self-summarizing your position, rather than showing empathy and negotiating and showing similarities, rather than just your point of view. This is important in the negotiation process, or even discussions that you have with other people that are from other diverse cultures, religions, om in ag te neem dat hulle ook standpunte het, dat hulle ook heilige het en profaan aspekte van hulle godsdienste, en dat dit miskien 'n idee is om daaroor te gesels. I mean, ons het voorbeelde gebruik in die verlede van hier in die Kaap. I mean, dis jammer hoe dit nou gebeur. As mense wat byvoorbeeld hulle geloof aan jou wil verduidelik. Nou kry jy hulle by die Stellenbosch treinstasie. Sê, meneer of mevrou, kan ek net 10 minute van u tyd neem? So 'n paar minuutjies van u tyd. En dan vertel hulle van hulle geloof en jy's regtig 'n ordentlike mens en jy wil luister, jy wil nie beskof wees nie, jy luister. Maar ag, moet tog iets sê van jou godsdienst nie. Hulle wil niks hoor van jou nie. Dit klink nie of sulke kommunikasie in vandag se lewe baie suksesvol noodwendig sal wees nie. So the other thing, of course, is it is important to spend time on healing and acknowledging the person's injuries or the nation's injuries. When you look at the Holocaust, there's a lot of time spent on this process of healing and understanding the ills that went on. It should be like that with everybody who has had a history of conflict, etc. So also we find, or this research shows, that it is not a bad idea to engage in storytelling. And that was what the Truth and Reconciliation post-apartheid was all about. It was about storytelling. Tutu sitting there and Alex Borain, dan kom die man op en dan vertel hy van, of sy vertel sy hoe sy haar seun verloor het, sy nooit weer haar seun gesien het na 1976 nie. Jy moet dit aanvaar, jy moet daardie mense geleentheid gee om daardie storie te vertel, so that she can heal, so that she can be a better person in the new South Africa, and of course, so that she can, in a sense, forgive and be forgiven. So what it is really an opportunity to share suffering that they've experienced. And then, of course, it also helps deal with a sense of victimization. As jy voel, jy was gevictimiseer, you were victimized, then it's not a bad idea om dit te uiter, sodat mense dit kan verstaan, so jy kan aanbeweeg. To address misperceptions, to break down stereotypes. Ag man, ons gaan net hierdie Jode vrek skiet, hulle is almal cheap. Ek hoor dit oor die jare, sulke taal word gebruik. Dis nie noodwendig die waarheid nie. Ag, dis blankes, hulle is almal rassisties. Ek hoor dit ook. Dis nie die waarheid nie. There's stereotypes, misconceptions. Talk about it. Maybe you have a friend that's a blanca, you find out it's not necessarily this. It's a fact. This is South Africa, I'm a sociologist, I ask the tough questions. And sometimes it hurts. Hy is al way verby die tyd. Ag, I'll end it there. Basically, thank you very much for everything. If there are any last questions, please go ahead. Waar is net 'n vraag?
Ek het dames se klas, ek gaan Afrikaans praat, want dit is 'n bietjie binne Afrikaans hoor. Maar ek net vir meneer Beck baie dankie sê vir meneer se kennis wat hy met ons gedeel het en dat hy so altyd so entoesiasties is in alle klasse en ek weet dat ons baie uit hierdie geleer het en dat ons vorentoe dit sal ons vorentoe kan vat met ander gelowe. Want ons is baie divers in hierdie land en dit kan dus voordeel wees. Baie dankie.